Well, one of the things that section 124 touches on are some temple themes. In this video, I'm going to move in and talk about baptisms for the dead with you. If you look at back in section 124, look at verse 29 to 31. The Lord talks about how they've been doing baptisms, and I'll back up a little bit. They had already started doing baptisms for the dead in the river, but the Lord in the Mississippi River and in other rivers. The Lord touches on that in verse 29 of section 124. For a baptismal font there is not upon the earth, that they, my saints, may be baptized for those who are dead. But then notice what the Lord says in verse 30, for this ordinance belongeth to my house, and cannot be acceptable to me only in the days of your poverty, where you are not able to build a house unto me. But I command you, all you my saints, to build a house unto me. And I grant unto you a sufficient time to build a house unto me, and during this time your baptisms shall be acceptable unto me, the ones that they were doing in the river. Let's talk a little bit about baptisms for the dead. This amazing, wonderful doctrine that, to me, there's many reasons, if I could speak personally, why I believe in the restored gospel of Jesus Christ. Many, many reasons. But one of those is the idea of the redemption of the dead. I do not know of any churches that have a doctrine or ordinances that addresses a key Christian question, which is this: if you have to accept Jesus to be saved, what about all the people who never have the opportunity to accept Jesus? Well, there are some who say, well then, God foreknew that, or they come up with different explanations, but they don't think they'll go to heaven. That really rakes against our feelings of God being a merciful God and a fair God, that those people would be condemned without any opportunity to accept his divine Son. On the flip side then, some people also come to the conclusion, well, that God wouldn't do that, and so God's going to save everybody, and they move more to universalism. And they say, well, then God is going to just save everybody no matter what, even if they don't accept his Son, which also introduces some difficulty in the equation. The beautiful thing about baptisms for the dead is that God says, no, people do need to accept my Son. They do need to obey the gospel. They do need to be baptized as a sign of coming into the covenant. And if they did not have the opportunity to do it here, then in the spirit world, they will be preached the gospel, and those on earth can turn to their dead and offer up the ordinance in the flesh, on the earth, in their behalf, that they in the spirit can then use their agency to accept that ordinance in their behalf. It's a beautiful doctrine. It in one idea shows the justice and the mercy of God in inviting all of his children to come into his covenant family to be saved with him in heaven. I love it. It's a beautiful, beautiful idea. Well, how did it develop? Where did it come from? Well, some of the earliest references we have is that Joseph Smith is preaching at a funeral. He's preaching at a funeral of a man named Seymour Brunson, who had died. And at the funeral, as Joseph's preaching there, he sees a woman who he doesn't identify her by name, but he, quote, saw a widow in that congregation that had a son who had died without being baptized. And Joseph said that this widow should have glad tidings. This is in September of 1840, as he's preaching at this funeral. That widow was likely a woman named Jane Nyman, who had had a son named Cyrus, who had died without ever being baptized. And we don't know when Jane Nyman does this, but Jane Nyman may be after this funeral of Seymour Brunson, where Joseph goes on to teach about this idea that those on earth can be baptized in behalf of the dead who didn't have the opportunity. Jane Nyman may be the first person to ever do a baptism for the dead in this dispensation. She grabs her friend Harvey Olmsted, who is an elder in the church, and asks Harvey to take her down to the river to be baptized for her son Cyrus, who had died without being baptized. She goes down there. Now, Harvey Olmsted doesn't even have a prayer. He doesn't even know what to say, but he's going to baptize her anyway. Vienna Jakes gets on horseback, and she rides into the river so that her exact recollection was that she witnessed the same when she leaves a later affidavit by riding into the river on horseback to get so close as to hear what the ceremony would be. And then Harvey Olmsted baptizes Jane Nyman in the river for her son, Cyrus, as Vienna Jakes on her horseback looks on. And I love that scene so much. I did this painting of it, wanting to represent the first baptism for the dead. And I think one of the just applications from it is this. Just notice, by the way, how unconventional this is. We have a baptism for the dead being done in a river, not in a temple. We have it being done by a woman being baptized in behalf of a male. We have an elder giving the ordinance that is not set. He's making up the prayer on the spot. And we have the witness being a woman on a horseback. Totally unconventional. And yet when Joseph Smith hears later that evening, he hears that a baptism for the dead was performed that day, he asks what words the elder had used in the ordinance. When they repeated back to him what the man had said, Joseph said that he, quote, had it right. And one of the ideas that I love from this is that the Lord accepts our sincere efforts to do His will, even if they may be done imperfectly at times. The Lord, in section 137, says He judges us based off of our works, but also the desires of our hearts. The other thing I want you to see is that baptisms for the dead developed little by little, line upon line. This idea of baptism for the dead might have come earlier in Kirtland. In section 137, in 1836, Joseph Smith had a vision where he saw his brother, Alvin, who had died without being baptized before the church was organized. Now, we know this is a future vision because Joseph also saw his father and mother in the celestial kingdom, and his father and mother were both alive at this time in section 137. As a matter of fact, his father was with him in the room when Joseph had the vision. I like to joke that he probably turned to his dad and said, I saw Alvin in the celestial kingdom. He made it. And I said, and I saw you and Mom in there too. You made it too, Dad. Nice job. High five. So we know it's a future vision. And that's when the Lord reveals to Joseph that He will judge everybody based off their works and the desires of their hearts. And the Lord didn't, from what we know anyway, He didn't reveal more about baptisms for the dead at the time. But you wonder if Alvin's death was, and then the vision of Alvin in the celestial kingdom, might have been the events that precipitated Joseph to begin thinking, how is it then that people who couldn't or didn't get baptized, but maybe who would have, because the Lord says, who would have accepted my gospel, they are heirs of salvation also. That got Joseph's wheels thinking about, well, how? How did they receive the ordinances that developed into it, that started to develop in Nauvoo? As I mentioned, originally they did not have a baptismal font, even though the Lord in section 124 said it belongs to His house to be done in the temple, so they did it in rivers. Something interesting about the development of it, it wasn't until, even though the first baptisms for the dead, like Jane Nyman, were done in the fall of 1840, it wasn't until November of 1841 that we began doing the first confirmations for the dead. I almost picture them doing, baptisms for over a year, and somebody has the bright idea to go, should we not be confirming them also? And they start doing that. It's not until April of 1845 that Brigham Young gives the directive that women should be baptized in behalf of women and men in behalf of men.